But the real opportunity is why we're here today, and that is wind and solar. Can we build globally?
It's back to the question that we had before about democracy. This stuff is really intertwined.
I'm increasingly of the view that Sandy's absolutely right. We need a backbone of HVDC that can move really efficiently a lot of power.
Then I think a grid, a super grid, a supercharged grid around the country is going to be sort of a big idea that somebody's going to embrace, like a Dwight D. Eisenhower, and we're going to get it.
And it's really important to remember that here at AREI, at AREDAY, our motto is from competition to collaboration. And we really try to strive for that, to have this open dialogue between every point of view in order to remember that we are actually all Americans at the end of the day. That's why we're the American Renewable Energy Institute, the American Renewable Energy Day, and our democracy, while it's being strained, is also determinedly the best form of government that we know of on the planet so far. So with that, I'd like to invite the next panel up here, which I'll be moderating, which is the high voltage direct current conversation. So if we could have one more time, we're going to ask Governor Bill Ritter to join us, along with Gary Dirks and Sandy MacDonald, who is actually, how should we say, Sandy is the godfather of the supergrid, but he's also has a long storied career in the institution of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which is a very large building down here on Broadway. And we want to thank Sandy for his years of dedication and service to our country, and also for inventing something called SOS, or Science on a Sphere, which is one of the great teaching tools. And I'll just tell you that when Sandy was at the U.S. Pavilion in 2009 in Copenhagen, I happened to be there at the COP 15. He showed us what this Science on a Sphere could do. And he had classes from all over the world, about 5 or 10 of them. I can't remember, Sandy, what that was. But they synced up the times, and he was able to have a teachable moment with students in Australia, students in Africa, students in America, all dialing in at the same time to Denmark to see his Science on a Sphere go back 4 billion years and bring us forward in terms of climate, in terms of what's happening in the real world. And now we're going to let Sandy tell us about what it means to have a high voltage direct current supergrid. Thanks, Sandy.
I want to thank Chip for the opportunity. Very excited about what I've seen here at AREDAY so far. It's my first one. And as Chip mentioned, I had a career in weather and climate. First 30 years, it was giving talks on the climate crisis is much bigger than you think it is back in the 1990s. About 2005, I had a major epiphany. And the epiphany was we really are not going to be able to stop this train. It's going too fast and the cliff is too close without some real changes. And I started concentrating on the issue of energy. And if you think about it, how can we decarbonize? And it's nuclear is one possibility. There's been a lot of history and work on that. But the real opportunity is why we're here today, and that is wind and solar. Can we build globally, not just in the United States, but globally, can we build a global energy economy that is decarbonized? And the epiphany essentially was this, that we are headed toward a huge destruction of the biological heritage of Earth. In Sheila's introduction, she talked about that, and there's a book that I've been spending 3 years in writing. My wife says I'll never get done, but it's called 3 Choices for Earth, and there's a picture of a tarsier. The tarsier is nearly extinct, but it's your 6 million generation great-grandmother. And there she is, looking at you with those big eyes in the lower right. We are headed toward an ocean that is 80% more acidic later this century. We are headed toward temperatures 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on the northern hemisphere land. And that means a huge die-off of our existing biological heritage unless we act now. So in my role as head of the Earth System Research Lab here in Boulder and also responsible for all the NOAA research labs, we set out to study, could wind and solar provide all of our energy? Not just the electric sector, but replace the fossil fuels, the petroleum, the natural gas. Could we replace everything? And so if you look at a supergrid, here's a picture of it. The idea is it's like the interstate highway system, except it's a supergrid for electrons. And it connects very nicely with these ideas in hydrogen. We saw in the CCS discussion the dangers of blue hydrogen, but we can have green hydrogen. We can use electrolysis to make it, to create hydrogen feedstocks, and to replace it if we can simply replace all of our primary energy. So in my book, I basically said we have to reach net zero globally below 500 parts per million of carbon dioxide. That means we have to start now. The more likely case is we're going to end up at 700 parts per million. That means that we don't figure this out until the 2040s and we get going then. Honestly, that is too late. And then there's the one that wipes out not just the biological heritage. The 700 is the one that wipes out the biological heritage. Global net zero by 900 ppm, we basically end up with a serious chance of a human extinction in a few hundred years. So the stakes couldn't be larger when they say existential. So surface temperature increases according to the IPCC. By the time we get to 700, the Arctic will be 13 degrees warmer. And then we have what's called the permafrost forest bomb. This summer in Canada, the fires generated 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide. The permafrost over the winters generating about 1.5 billion tons. That's starting to grow. We're only 6 degrees warmer in the Arctic, but we're going to 13 degrees if we go to 700. So there is a reason that we have to act very fast. We don't have time to start in the 2040 and 2060. We have to act now. Now, why do I think we're going to 700? The Energy Information Agency of the US is independent from DOE. They get to actually say what they think is really going to happen. And what they say in their report is between now and 2050, there will be more petroleum usage in the US than there is now. Between now and 2050, natural gas is going to go up quite a bit, coal's going to go down a little. Basically, we have a set of policies. I'm hugely positive about what's being done in things like the Inflation Reduction Act and so on. But to be honest, it's a global problem, and even in the US, our policies are not going to get us there. And I'll say why in just a second. The answer that our team here in Boulder, the NOAA lab, came up with was wind and solar work only if you can move it from where the wind is blowing at every instant, the energy, to where it is being used. And both of those vary. Demand varies and wind and solar varies. So we can achieve net zero CO2 emissions at comparable or lower cost, but you can only do it if you essentially get all your primary energy. Here I say 85% wind and solar, the rest is hydro and nuclear. We could have that system by 2050 and it would work. It's a solution. But you have to have continental supergrids. Our existing transmission was designed for fossil fuels. So if you basically build a big coal plant, put it near the city, or a big nuclear plant, and you have one-way transmission, all the power starts in the coal plant and goes to the city, okay, that's fine. That's not the system that we need. Right now, we need a system that's two-way. You have to generate across the country all these rural people who really have been economically disadvantaged. That's where we build these wind farms, these solar, and you basically have to have the ability to move that energy two-way to make that happen. Here's a quick example. This is a evening of January 7th, 2022. The playoffs are going. Eastern United States has got no wind and no sun. You have a 40 billion watt shortfall, but out west, there's sun shining in the southwest, there's winds blowing in the Wyoming and the Dakotas. You have to be able to move energy, continental scale, if you're going to have wind and solar be your 85% of your continental energy. My team worked for 7 years. We published in Nature Climate Change. Nature magazine takes all their articles and looks at them. This basically said, we can solve with supergrids on all 6 inhabited continents. We can build a decarbonized system. This was ranked in the 95th percentile of all Nature magazine publications. So what did we say? Well, we said we used a supercomputer that we had there in Boulder all the way back in Tim Worth's day, and David Skaggs and our other Boulder people helped us get a big supercomputer there. And so we used it to model and design national networks that would be able to get to essentially 80–90% solar and wind energy. Our current system, every time we tried that in the supercomputer, we're limited to about 30% wind and solar. The rest has to be natural gas plants, and if that happens globally, we're sunk. You have to get to a totally decarbonized system. We didn't use subsidies or anything like that. We created a national real-time market. We had the supercomputer design this, and essentially it said, we can do this. The real revolution has been that wind and solar energy, if you build a big wind farm in Wyoming right now, you can produce wind energy for 2.4 cents a kilowatt hour, according to Lazard. You can go to Arizona, where Gary and the people have all those photons, and you can produce solar energy for 2.4 cents a kilowatt hour. Nuclear right now, 16 cents. Coal, 9 cents. This is a huge revolution, but it doesn't work unless you have a supergrid. So here's the system that our supercomputer designed. Those little thin lines are the supergrid. The green things are the wind, and the red things are the solar. It didn't put it all in one place. It spread it across the country. So basic idea that I have in my book is that it's a national and global emergency. Build this thing as one thing, like Eisenhower built the interstate. You basically say to the railroads, which is already actually in legislation, this is a national emergency. You can make a whole lot of money and help this country. We'll put these underground big cables that carry billions of watts along railroad right-of-way. So here's that example. It's an anywhere-to-anywhere network, just like your phones. And it's trying to not let me do something here. Okay, I'll try again. So just sort of to jump here, what you have is anywhere in the country you can get 100% reliability, because if you have your green hydrogen gas plants, they can be anywhere in the country. If you're short of energy in Florida, you can get it there. It can be being generated in California. And you have battery dispatchable and others. So our paper in Nature basically said this whole thing can be highly reliable and low cost. What does that look like? Well, there's a company called Sioux Greenline that is building one of these. They proposed it. They got there right away in 2 years. Contrast that with trying to build a overground, a big, high transmission line. It can be done like SunZia, but it takes 20 years. This is sort of saying we can't wait 20 years. Basically, you go back to what Eisenhower said, which is, if I can't solve a problem, I make it bigger. And that's what he did with the interstate highways. That's what Lincoln did when he said, we need transcontinental railways. We are now at a stage where if we're going to solve our problems, not just in the United States, but globally, we have to think big enough that we can take advantage of nature's own energy, wind and solar energy, and basically use that. So with that, I think I'll have somebody figure out how to turn off the...
Great. Thanks, Sandy. If you want to sit down, we'll just start this panel discussion. So I'd like to move it right to the end there with Gary Dirks. We've been on this Zoom with Sandy and some of the other folks like Mike McCracken and Bob Corral, they've spent their careers really digging in and thinking about what to do about our nation's energy. And so can you guys kind of bring us up to speed with your thinking down there at ASU regarding this supergrid conversation? And what's the likelihood of this actually happening, given, what we're asking for here is a true public-private partnership, I think. Go ahead.
Sure. So let me begin by reinforcing a couple of things that Sandy had to say. I sit on the advisory group to the two largest utilities in the state, and they've been going through a process of putting together their integrated systems plans between now and 2035. And overwhelmingly new capacity, and we need a lot of new capacity. One of them is openly talking about tripling the amount of generation capacity that they currently have in order to meet both the demand growth and the impact of hotter weather. They need to add a lot of energy. Overwhelmingly, that's solar in Arizona, not too surprisingly. But that creates a very interesting conundrum for us, which is at 10 o'clock, running to about 2 o'clock, and I mentioned this in the earlier panel, in the spring and fall in particular, we have so much solar energy we don't know what to do with it. Then, beginning at about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we get this massive big ramp where demand kicks in, and it really strains the system to be able to follow that ramp. Now, what are these guys going to do? Well, they're going to put in a lot of solar, and they're also going to do natural gas. And in fact, one of them, controversially, just said, and is in the process of doing, putting in 800 megawatts of fast ramp natural gas. And their intent in doing that is to not run it more than about 200 hours a year. Now, whether that turns out to be 200 or 400 is, frankly, irrelevant. It's why in the world would you put in that much power and run it for such a short period of time? And it's because they can't move enough power in to Arizona in the summertime when they really need it, and consequently, we can't get the power out. So what are we thinking about, to Chip's question, at ASU? Well, we've got to find a way to deal with this disparity in when we have this abundance of solar and what we actually need to match our demand curve. Now, some of that's going to be shifting demand. It's going to be really, really expensive for people to charge their electric vehicles at night because we need to charge them at 10 o'clock in the morning. But there's only about so much you can do with that. And then you have to move power. That's what I believe, at least. You've got to move the power. That can be high voltage AC, but as I've participated more in some of the discussions that Sandy and Chip is referring to, I'm increasingly of the view that Sandy's absolutely right. We need a backbone of HVDC that can move really efficiently a lot of power. And that's kind of where we are.
Thanks, Gary. Now, Bill Ritter, when you were the governor, I remember trailing you around with my camera when I was making some films back in those days about energy and such. And I remember going to one meeting, I believe it was with the governor of Wyoming at that time. I might be mistaken, but the point is that we were talking about a regional
Transmission organization.
yeah.
RTO.
Could you speak to where we were then in 2006-07, where we are now, and how you see the likelihood of such a super grid actually happening in today's political environment?
Yeah, so 2006 to now, there's been some evolution of regionalization, but not to the point of an RTO. And so out of California, there's ISO, and it's its own grid, and then there is a RTO to the east of us called the Southwest Power Pool, and the west is still without a grid and with a variety of different balancing authorities. So there have been major utilities that have joined. First of all, they joined an energy imbalance market that comes out of the Cal ISO, and now they're joining an everyday ahead market, it's called. So that makes them a better regional player than they were 10 years ago, but the discussions on the RTO are still very much not happening in a way that there's promise for moving an RTO forward. The problem has a lot to do with politics. There's a lot of states in the West that have a political leadership that doesn't quite trust California. And I would say the single biggest issue, if you go to Wyoming, go to Montana, go to Idaho, go to even Utah, they are states that believe that Colorado, California, we have our climate goals, and that if they have customers who are paying for transmission built by their utility, they're in part going to be subsidizing these clean energy goals or climate goals in California, Colorado, New Mexico, other states. Nevada has a climate goal as well. And so, they look at this and say, no, our folks don't want to pay. Well, there are ways to do cost allocation. There are absolutely ways to do this for an RTO. This is not talking about Sandy's super grid, but there are answers to those things. It's just that it's back to the question that we had before about democracy. This stuff is really intertwined. So let's take just Sandy's idea. I had a lot of conversations during the days of the Clean Power Plan because we convened the governor's offices. And first of all, they said, well, you can't get transmission permitted very easily in the West. It takes a long time. Idaho had a transmission line that took 13 years from the time they conceived of it until the time they got it permitted, not built, but permitted. And, especially on federal land, it can be quite difficult because of all the processes that are federal. Nevada's 85% federal land. Idaho's 66%. States like Montana, Wyoming, Colorado are in the 40s, in the mid-40s. And there's just different processes. And there's Bureau of Land Management land that's under the Department of Interior. There's, forest land that's under the Department of Agriculture. And so, we do have to have some thinking about reform. I don't disagree at all with Sandy in the need to think about a super grid as part of this. The stat that we think about, and the world that I live in with renewable energy and state work on that, we're going to have to triple the pace at which we're building renewables by 2030. And when we get to 2030, to get to our 2050 goal, we're going to have to quadruple the pace that we just tripled. So the build out of renewables in this country is going to have to be massive, and that is going to require a new grid. So we went to the White House with utility CEOs to say, this is too tough right now to really permit this stuff on federal land. It has to be easier, and it's been part of the conversation about permitting reform. There's some real important social justice and environmental justice questions around that, but it's, you know, it's something that we ought to think very hard about in terms of how we build out the grid. We did talk to the White House as part of that conversation I mentioned earlier, where I was talking to CEOs of utilities and CEOs of environmental NGOs, environmental justice groups, and the White House crowd that came in with President Biden was not about building a super grid. They wanted to build more interconnections and more ties. So they passed this infrastructure law, which would have been an opportunity to think about, you know, a whole different grid, kind of an Eisenhower moment, and they passed on it. They passed on it. They did develop a grid resiliency innovation partnership. So they stood up a new office inside the Department of Energy called GRIP. And there's 3 different levels of funding that come out of the Department of Energy, 3 different categories of funding that are about grid resiliency, grid modernization, and, you know, technology necessary for grid modernization. But they still haven't attached themselves to this idea. And so we don't have, you know, it's the most climate-friendly administration I think we've had. I think President Obama probably ran a very close second. But the Biden administration, the folks there believe, you know, this is a crisis. We need to address it. We need to address it quickly. And we did not get out of the bipartisan infrastructure law or really the Inflation Reduction Act what would be required to do what Sandy's contemplating. So the politics of that are very, very difficult. The last thing I'll say is, there's a real siting question, S-I-T-I-N-G, on the renewables part of it. And even if you use railroad rights of way, we're running into this all over the country, what we call NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard, organized opposition against the development of wind and solar arrays that are utility scale. We developed a new term inside of the Center for the New Energy Economy. It's called NIMSB. Not in my second backyard, because we get all these people that are like, you know, environmentalists and conservationists, but man, just trying to do something across from their ranch, you know, and it really becomes sort of a problem, right? That powerful people who believe that the environment still, you know, are concerned about transmission coming in too close to them. Burying it, putting it under railway rights of ways actually solves a lot of these problems, but the political discussion has not gotten to a place where anybody is thinking as big as the scientists are.
Right. Okay, now Sandy, I know you want to make a quick comment, and then I have something to say too.
Yeah, just a quick comment. The interesting part of our NOAA study, which took place between 2009 and 2016, was that it kind of predicted that if you don't have a complete redo of the electric system, not just the supergrid, but also things like the Colorado Power Path, which is a great thing. It allows us to bring in this energy. That if you don't have this redo of the whole electric system, we'll never get beyond 30% because it's going to be cheaper and more reliable to build natural gas and try to keep coal going and so on. So it's not that it's optional. I think we have to have a new electric system if we're going to have a completely new energy economy.
So can I ask Sandy a question? Just saying that, then why didn't a very climate-friendly administration doing the biggest public investment in sort of climate, why didn't they gravitate to something different where the grid is concerned? And I ask that without, I mean, I'm not trying to set you up. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer.
I guess one thing I really admire is people like Bill Ritter and Joe Biden and everybody that fights these battles. I had a job in Washington for quite a few years and would go down to the Hill and go to the administration. I think they have to be realistic about what they can get done. I briefed the White House on this concept this year, and they said, it's great. It has no chance right now. And I'm saying, well, it has no chance, but it has to happen fast if we're going to save the biological heritage of this planet.
Thank you.
So just for a quick refresher for the audience, just so they understand what really is on the table here. The U.S. grid is comprised of three parts: the Eastern grid, the Western grid, and the Texas grid. And they don't really talk to each other very well in terms of the interconnects. And on top of that, they're regulated by the FERC in Washington and then 50 state PUCs, Public Utility Commissions. Now, the transmission grid has built out in this country according to the growth of the population. So let's go back to when we really started it about 100 years ago. And it's sort of a happenstance. And then within that structure, you have the independent system operator, the ISO. You've got the federal grid systems, WAPA, BPA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And you've got, well, any number of others, including the municipal utilities, that are managing the transmission of this energy. And in aggregate, this constitutes approximately 40% of the carbon throughput to the atmosphere that's contributed annually by the United States of America. So this is a very, very, very complicated issue here on how the power is produced. You know, you mine coal, you dig it out of the ground, you put it on a train, you send it to a 1,000 megawatt coal burner up in Craig, Colorado. They burn a ton of carbon, they make a lot of electricity, they ship it over hundreds of miles of transmission lines, sometimes with up to 30% line loss on a hot day, okay? So we couldn't have invented a better system of carbonizing the atmosphere probably, and now we have to figure out how to make that transition. So, you know, back to the politics of it. I know that, Gary, you suffered through 31 days of consecutive 110-degree temperatures this summer. 31 consecutive days of, how do you do that? And now cooling, you know, is becoming more of an energy-intensive operation than even lighting our homes or heating them.
How did we do it? Stay inside. Keep the air conditioners running. Actually, if I could, I'd like to change the question just a little bit, because I want to come back to something that was said in the democracy panel, and Governor Ritter has raised it again. And this is about, where do you put the renewable energy? Our university, very much like CSU, engages a lot in a transdisciplinary way with communities, as well as energy providers and the public more generally. And we're seeing a really big backlash against building new solar plants in rural areas. And in fact, one of our counties will pass within the next couple of weeks what they're calling a moratorium for 1 year on any new utility scale development. And we listen in on these kind of commissioner meetings, and you kind of sit there thinking to yourself, well, where are you getting the information about this? And increasingly what becomes apparent is just the way in which we engage with these populations isn't working. Now, why am I raising that? Well, this is where a lot of the power is going to go, is into rural areas. And it's going to connect to transmission lines to get it to where we need it. In the case of northwestern Arizona, it's going to go to Phoenix, it's going to go to Las Vegas, and it's going to go to Los Angeles. That's where it's going to go. Now, the transmission system we have right now can just about take that amount of power because we're closing down coal plants and opening up transmission lines. But we're going to run out of those really quick. And then we're going to need something else. And to your point, Chip, about the grids not getting on well together, they don't communicate at all unless you do it through HVDC. You cannot send one electron from the western grid to the eastern grid or vice versa, except through HVDC. And the same is true of Texas. Part of the reason Texas is having all the problems they're having, aside from the fact that they won't weatherize their generation capacity, is they won't connect with the rest of the grid. They won't connect with either the east or the west. Two tiny little lines, so they can't share power. And this goes to Sandy's point. We're going to have to be able to share power. It's just a question of how we do it.
Good point. So, Sandy, we obviously need to have an HVDC now, a supergrid. Is this only going to be a coast-to-coast, border-to-border application, or can we take a regional approach to build this out?
It's one of these things where you can start small. Not me, but some people like some economists and others have looked at the idea that if you're going to build a national grid, it's sort of like toll roads. The Denver toll road was going to be built, Denver-Boulder toll road was going to be built in the 2040s. And then they built it as a toll road with a private investor, and it was built in 3 years. So the basic idea is you can start small. You can say, okay, from North Dakota to Chicago is a lucrative transmission market. You can, based on a national design, allow companies to bid on a franchise to do that. Just the state of Colorado still owns the toll road, but a company has built it and is running it. So we can start small. And one more point, I think we got into a little bit of the jargon and complexity of the electric system, which is why I'm glad I spent a third of my career trying to understand energy. These independent service and other kind of transmission organizations were part of the deregulation that occurred in the 90s, and they're a good thing. They actually allow a market, a structured market over a small area, California, or not small, but not over the whole country. So they evolved to allow a market for electricity. This is, the idea here is take one more step up, because you have to have that step up if we're going to be able to use wind and solar. And one final point, I was sort of, got a lot of flack from NOAA when I said, you know, we want to work on energy. They said, you're out of your swim lane, you know, what are you doing working on energy? I said, well, wind and sun are weather. And the scale size of weather is 2,000 miles. If it's not windy here, it's probably not going to be windy 100 or 200 or 500 miles away. That's why you need to be able to move it across the whole continent. So I think this is a natural step up from the smaller grids that we have with the independent system operators to a national independent system operator that we can build piecewise with private industry taking a part.
So, Governor,
The Southwest Power Pool is in 15 states. They'll have days in January and February where 75% of all their power comes from wind in those states. And so it's kind of to Sandy's point, and there's trapped wind in those states that's not being taken onto the grid. So imagine that's the kind of the spine of the country, the middle of the country. If you can move that east and west, you could provide power to a lot more people that's wind energy than just the 15 states.
I'd like to turn the conversation to the economics of such an undertaking. Now, I think, Sandy, we've talked about maybe a $3 trillion number to get, which is, you know, let's remind everybody that America has a $25 trillion annual GDP, and we can do this. And actually, you know, now that we know how we deficit spend, I mean, everybody can say the word trillion all of a sudden, right? And so. And that's a recent development. But the point is that to incentivize the private sector to want to work with the government in order to do this, What's it going to take? I understand they're doing this in China. They have these super grids that are going in there. Other places in the world. What's it going to take to do it in America to incentivize Wall Street to make the investment?
Well, a quick comment, and again, this is the tough thing. You have to think of all of it. So we do have an arm's length deal. I took a bunch of MBA courses when I got my PhD in meteorology. So the professor said, well, don't believe anybody's cost figures. Wait until there's actually somebody who's building one and see what they're charging. So in the Sioux Green Line from Mason City, Iowa to the Chicago area, the estimate is $7 million a mile for 2 billion watts. If you scale that to a 60,000 mile network that I just showed, it's $2 trillion, which is not a lot of money, especially when you consider it's for like a toll road where you already have customers who are going to pay your mortgage or your capital costs. So it's not monstrously costly because it's not something that goes on the taxpayers. It's basically they're going to pay for an additional 2 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you're in Arizona and you produce it for 2 cents, which is where we're about to get, you produce the power 2 cents a kilowatt hour, you add 2 cents and you can sell it in New York.
So Gary, you want to put your 2 cents in?
I would like to put a couple more cents in. Several of you have mentioned other parts of the world, and I do think it's worth looking at what's happening in other places. China, for example, has more installed wind than the rest of the world combined. And what are they doing? And a lot of that's out in the middle of nowhere, in Inner Mongolia in particular. And what are they doing? They're building some of the biggest HVDC systems on the planet. Not only HVDC, but they're building really big ones. I think for the United States, we really, really, really need to watch Europe. Because what the Europeans did in cutting themselves off from oil and especially from natural gas from Russia is just an incredibly breathtaking thing that they did. Now, admittedly, the first thing they did then is go out and contract for floating LNG terminals and sign up a lot of contracts. But they're also undertaking one of the most extraordinary build-outs of renewable energy any place on the planet. And they're linking it up with HVDC wherever they can do that. I think we're going to learn a tremendous amount by watching what they do over the next 5 years or so.
Yes, and let's remember that the United States and China together have half of the world's GDP out of the 80 trillion annually by 193 countries. U.S. and China have half of that. U.S. #1, China #2, but they also together put up about half of the CO2. So at AREDAY, at AREI, we call that G2, and we really do have to look at those two issues. So just to wrap this up as we come to a close, can we have some final thoughts about the likelihood of a supergrid actually happening in the United States? Maybe we should get a Speaker of the House first. I don't know. What do you think? Bill, Ritter, what do you think about how this can actually manifest in reality?
So think of the Inflation Reduction Act and the idea that it can incentivize the build-out of renewables. I think we'll see the impact on economies. You asked about Wall Street, which I think is a really good question, but we also need to say, what about at the local level? What about counties? How are counties faring, when you build new renewables there? There's a conservative group, the Western Way, that did a study of 2 counties contiguous in Colorado. One did not embrace wind, actually may have had a moratorium for a time. The other embraced wind, and the difference is $235 million in their tax base, Washington County and Kit Carson County. So thinking about this at the local level, because it's not just that we need to build out a supergrid, we need to massively infuse the grid with renewable energy, and you should think about that as a system, right? And I think that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to have this positive impact on our build out of renewables, and over time, and I don't know how much the time is, I think the country may get to a place of saying, well, we have to have a grid that can accommodate this in a way that really does reduce emissions and where we're accomplishing goals. I think when the White House said, listen, it's impossible, they're probably talking about the politics in Congress, right? They're talking about the makeup of Congress and the inability to pass things, even in a sort of democratically controlled Senate, because you still have, a senator from West Virginia to contend with on things that will see fossil fuels go away. And so I think it is a difficult conversation in the Congress, absolutely. But if we are successful in the build out of renewables over the next 7 or 8 years, then I think a grid, a super grid, a supercharged grid around the country is going to be sort of a big idea that somebody's going to embrace, like a Dwight D. Eisenhower, and we're going to get it.
Great. And Gary, you have some thoughts?
Well, I'd like to offer another possibility that we could think about. I think it's going to be very instructive to see what happens with these hydrogen hubs. Because the idea there was to create a national network. It is to create, not was, is to create a national network. And do it by creating these hubs that will ultimately link together. Now, as I said in the earlier panel on hydrogen, we in Arizona and Nevada are almost certainly not going to get one. But we brought $6 of private money for every dollar we asked for in government money. None of that came from fossil fuels. That's all from companies that are new to hydrogen and want to get into it. I have no reason to believe that's not going to be the case for all of the hubs. The leverage is going to be enormous. Now, if that works, there's your model for HVDC. Just do it again, link them up.
Great. Now, Sandy, let's let you have the last word on this panel, and why don't you bring us home?
Okay, we're talking about democracy. We're talking about the future of the planet. We're talking about the energy system. If you think about sun, here's a surprising fact. The place that gets the most solar energy on Earth are 2 points. They're for the summer and winter solstice, namely the North Pole and the South Pole. On June 21st, the North Pole gets more solar energy than anywhere else. Actually, if you look at solar energy, there's only a factor of 2 difference between the equator and the pole, because they get so much more as the as the Earth is tilted. So wind and solar are naturally, globally occurring much more than oil and gas. South America and Africa have only a few percent, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, not North Africa. They only have a few percent of the Earth's oil and gas. And they've been disadvantaged hugely for the last century. Sun and wind are distributed over the whole planet. You can put up a solar panel on your house whether you're here or whether you're in Africa or anywhere else. And so the basic idea of wind and solar energy becoming by far the cheapest energy resource is a naturally democratic thing. It spreads the wealth of energy. A final comment. My hometown, Glendive, Montana, is about the reddest in a red state. And I go back there every summer. I rub elbows with all my friends who have their Trump signs out. And all at once, this guy wanted to put up a 300 megawatt wind farm near Glendive. At first, they were really against it. Then they discovered that they'd get $7 million of tax from the wind farm, and they kind of changed their tune. Wind and solar are very democratic. They spread over the rural areas that have been cheated and marginalized, like my hometown, and they I think, see the economic advantages. And so this is not just an energy modernization. It also gives us, I think, a better shot at democracy in the U.S. and globally.
Well, I just want to thank the esteemed panel here. Let's give them a big round of applause if we can. Okay.